The defense of the American combat base at Khe Sanh was given the code name Operation Scotland. Khe Sanh was one of the most remote outposts in Vietnam, but by January 1968, even the American president, Lyndon Johnson, had taken a personal interest. With the Marines facing a full-scale siege by the North Vietnamese army, the question was being asked, should the base be held, or should it be quietly abandoned? Many in Washington worried that defending Khe Sanh could invite a costly and humiliating defeat. General Westmoreland, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, dismissed all such fears. Already, Khe Sanh was tying up nearly 20,000 North Vietnamese troops, and there might be a chance of winning a major American victory. General Rath von Tompkins, the new commander of the 3rd Marine Division, was also convinced that the base could and should be held. To boost the defenses, he had sent a 3rd Battalion of the 26th Marines as reinforcements. They were directed to Hill 558, from where they could provide fire support. There were now 5,000 American troops at Khe Sanh. The combat base at Khe Sanh was built around a 3,900-foot airstrip. Beside the strip was the Marine Air Traffic Control Unit. Nearby was the 26th Marine Command Post and the Fire Support Coordination Center. At the eastern end of the base was the main ammunition dump, with a secondary dump to the west. The base perimeter was manned by the 1st Battalion and a company of the 3rd. There was also a forward operating base run by Special Forces. The infantry were backed by tank and anti-tank units and an artillery battalion of the 13th Marines. Outside the Khe Sanh base, the Marines held Hill 881 South, Hill 861, and a radio relay station on Hill 950. The whole 2nd Battalion occupied Hill 558 to block the Rao Quan River Valley. Beyond 881 South, the North Vietnamese 325C Division had secretly fortified a chain of hills. On January 20th, 1968, the Americans thwarted an attempt to take 881 South, and just after midnight the next day, 861 was partially overrun, but the attackers were also driven off. At 5:30 a.m., Khe Sanh base itself was hammered by a massive North Vietnamese artillery bombardment. The shattering barrage of shells, mortars, and rockets, which slammed into the Marine combat base at 0530 on January 21st, signaled the start of the battle for Khe Sanh. The North Vietnamese gunners had targeted their bombardment with unerring accuracy. As Marines had dived for cover, one of the first rounds had scored a direct hit on the main ammunition store. The number 1 dump stored 1,500 tons of artillery and mortar rounds 90% of the base's entire stock, or 10,000 rounds. All of it was lost. 18 men were killed instantly, and 40 were wounded, as the ammunition exploded and shells and mortar rounds flew in every direction. The explosions would go on for another 48 hours. Even at the height of the chaos, the Marines were still able to fire their mortars and guns against the enemy batteries. They also called in air support, and very quickly, fighter bombers were blasting the suspected locations of the North Vietnamese artillery, which in return scored 300 direct heavy artillery hits on the firebase. As the bombardment of the base reached a crescendo, the 26th Marines commander, Colonel David Lowndes, expected a massive North Vietnamese ground attack at any moment. But the attack didn't come. The North Vietnamese infantry had a different objective. The target was Khe Sanh village, 3 miles from the Marine combat base. At dawn on January 21st, NVA troops attacked Khe Sanh village, where 200 Marines and South Vietnamese troops were stationed. The North Vietnamese attackers were a 400-man battalion of the 66th Regiment. The battalion attacked twice, but in the face of powerful American artillery and airstrikes, failed to take the village. An attempt at reinforcement by a South Vietnamese unit went disastrously wrong, and the whole force was destroyed. Later in the day, the village was evacuated and abandoned to the NVA. Later that evening, Khe Sanh base itself was probed by a North Vietnamese assault unit. L Company of the 3rd Battalion drove off the attack. The following day, the base's western flank was reinforced by the newly arrived 1st Battalion of the 9th Marines, deployed at a quarry a mile from the perimeter. A platoon was detached from the battalion to occupy the nearby hill 64. For the Marines inside the Khe Sanh base, the days were now filled with feverish activity. There were sudden heavy bombardments from NVA guns and rockets. The massive damage done by the first barrage still had to be repaired. The biggest worry was ammunition. The first aircraft to land all carried shells. More than 130 tons were delivered in just 2 days. Reinforcements arrived too. The Marines were joined by 300 South Vietnamese Army Rangers, and Colonel Lowndes now had more than 6,000 men inside the compound and in 7 defended positions on the surrounding hills. While the Marines at Khe Sanh braced themselves for the attack that was surely coming, General Westmoreland warned Washington that the battle could be the turning point of the whole war. In the United States, President more and more worried about what might happen. The last thing he wanted was an American version of Dien Bien Phu, but he was determined to support his commander. Westmoreland would be allowed to fight the battle he wanted. There would be no U.S. withdrawal from Khe Sanh, despite the fact that the NVA were still raining between 150 and 300 shells a day on Khe Sanh. It was the awesome potential of American air power that convinced U.S. military leaders that Khe Sanh could be defended. Before the battle had started, on 5th January, Westmoreland and U.S. tacticians devised a plan for defending Khe Sanh by bombing. It was already being unleashed on the North Vietnamese divisions with devastating effect. The Americans called it Operation Niagara. The first part of Niagara was to pinpoint North Vietnamese troop concentrations. Information from air reconnaissance, special forces teams, radio interception, and every other possible source was fed into the intelligence system. Niagara also deployed the most advanced and secret surveillance technology in the world. Aircraft and helicopters scattered hundreds of electronic sensors across the enemy's main lines of approach. They could detect the movement of troops and send signals to alert the Americans. As the intelligence picture built up, Operation Niagara quickly gathered momentum. In spite of rivalry between the Air Force and the Marines over who should control operations, every available warplane in the area was standing by. At the peak of the siege, American planes dropped triple the tonnage of bombs delivered on a peak day during World War II. Added to this, fighter bombers would deliver 54,500 tons of napalm alone. Although fighter bombers were flying the vast majority of Niagara missions, most of the sheer weight of bombs was being delivered by B-52s as part of an ongoing operation codenamed Arclight. The strikes were flown around the clock. A cell of 3 B-52s arrived over the Khe Sanh area every 90 minutes. The giant heavy bomber was able to carry a massive 27 tons of bombs. The aircraft dropped their loads from 30,000 feet, high enough so that the planes couldn't be seen or heard from the ground. The only warning most North Vietnamese troops got of a raid was the shattering detonation of the first bombs. Over the 77 days of the siege, B-52s flew over 2,500 sorties, dropping more than 53,000 tons of bombs. The biggest Arclight raid of the Vietnam War so far was launched as part of Operation Niagara on January 30th. American radio direction finding seemed to have discovered North Vietnamese Army headquarters for the Khe Sanh offensive. Whether it was or not, no one is sure, but the site was annihilated by 2 B-52 raids in a single day. Early in the morning of January 30th and 31st, 1968, the general offensive the Viet Cong had been planning for more than 6 months broke with shattering force all over South Vietnam. As tens of thousands of Viet Cong attacked towns, cities, and military installations, American commanders were stunned by the sheer scale of the assault. While most of South Vietnam erupted in violence, Khe Sanh was uncannily quiet. A North Vietnamese army defector had confirmed that there was to be a major attack, but nothing had happened yet. Some U.S. commanders believed that the Arclight raids had shattered the North Vietnamese command system. There was no way of telling. As the tide of the Viet Cong's Tet Offensive swept over South Vietnam, most of the advance was being countered